if you were to do the Tlingit have a memory of John Muir? Is he part of, or do they have an awareness of him, or is he just one of many white men who've come to his land? Do they have any opinion, I guess, of him?
Definitely.
So here's the follow-up question. What would they say to the Sierra Club for calling him a racist?
Well, I'll tell you this. Tlingits are kind of like white people. They have different opinions. And so some Tlingits would say that John Muir was a cool guy. And in fact, I'll give you an example, here in a minute. Other Tlingits would say that he was a colonizer. Today, the further away you get from Klukwan, which is Klukwan and the Chilkat and the Chilkoot people, which is really the pinnacle of rhetorical interaction in my book, that kind of leads up to it. But the farther you get away, like you go down to Juneau, 100 miles south of there, and you'll find it's a very political place, and there are political Tlingits, and they'll say John Muir was another colonizer, and they're not real happy about John Muir. You go to other places, other small villages, like Cake or Angoon, they had an interaction with John Muir. Some people say, well, if it wasn't for John Muir, we wouldn't have a church here, and thank God for that. By the way, Muir he was very uncomfortable with missionaries. He didn't want to be a missionary. But on the trip, wherever they stopped, there was speechifying. And certainly S. Hall Young wanted to give his sermons, and the Tlingit men in their canoe were the church Indians from his church. And so they would sing a hymn or do something like that. And then it would be John Muir's turn to speak. And the closest that he got to talking missionary talk was saying, and this is another reason that I don't think he was really that racist. His little sermon was that we are all sons and daughters of the Great Spirit. You have 10 fingers and 10 toes. I have 10 fingers and 10 toes. We like to eat food. We have similar things. If you took a Tlingit child to the South Seas, he said, and they were raised in the South Seas, and then they came back to Southeast Alaska, they might not know how to speak Tlingit. They would be like another human being in another culture. So ultimately, we are all brothers and sisters. Well, when he said this, the Tlingits were like, we like that. You're the first white guy who's ever put us on the same level on top of the totem pole. And so that was his lecture, and very successful. In fact, in many of the villages, the speeches would go on, and Muir would generally be the last speaker because he really didn't want to speak and didn't want to he was trying to figure out how do I get to sound like a missionary but not sound like one. And he would finally give his speech, and the audience would applaud, and they would stand up. They would say, you are a good speaker. We want to hear more. By the way, Tlingits applaud by pounding their feet. And so they would pound their feet, and this roar would fill up in the tribal house. And they would say, you're a much better speaker than the missionary man. And so they liked him because he also answered natural history questions for them about the tides and about the stars and, ice and that sort of thing. And they really liked that. Well, eventually they got up to the place that they were planning to get up to. They got up to, they landed in Deshu. Klukwan is 20 miles up the river. The little village there at Deshu is called Yendistucky. They were met by the Tlingit people who brought them in. They had asked 3 years earlier. They said, we want a missionary too, because we hear that missionaries will build a house for the chief. And there is no chief among Tlingits. It's a head man. It's sort of like a CEO of the corporation, because you have a board of directors and all of that. But so finally the missionary arrived. The people gathered in there by the hundreds, and they even tore out the sides of the longhouse so that people could fit in more, and young people went up high and hung in the rafters. And so you can just imagine the speeches going on in the longhouse were just completely surrounded by a wall of human beings. And Muir, as usual, people had to lure him into speaking. He didn't speak until the last thing of the evening, and then people got very, very excited as he did that. And he also learned the Tlingit people with him from a few other instances earlier on. They said, you cannot refuse Tlingit food. Don't turn your nose up at Tlingit food. If you eat Tlingit food, you will make friends with the Tlingit. And so they turned their nose up earlier on the trip, but by the time they got to the Chilkat and Chilkoot people, they ate, or at least tried to make it look like they were eating all of the things that were coming to them, which got those people really excited. They were like, you're the first white people we've known who doesn't have to eat Boston food. And so Muir was very close to them. His last night up there, he was giving a speech and he heard a baby crying. And the baby was crying all night long. And Muir was very close to children and very young children. He loved them. They loved him. And finally, at the end of the night, he said, what's the matter with the baby? And the head man said, oh, his mother died and he hasn't been fed for a while. And by tomorrow, he should be gone. He's going to die. And Muir said, well, we can't let that happen. And so he asked his crew to run out to the canoe and bring in some canned milk and evaporated milk. And so they brought milk, and I think there were 8 or 10 cans of milk, and he fed that baby for a while and gave it to somebody else. And they fed him all night long. The next morning, the baby is laughing and smiling, and the head man says, well, you're the one who saved this kid, so you take him. And Muir said, oh, no, I'm going back down to California. I'm going to get married. What would my wife say if I brought a baby, there before we get married? That wouldn't be so good. So the baby stayed there and Muir went on. So, there's lots more I can say about it, but basically.
Wow. That's his whole trip. So that's basically his whole trip to Alaska. His first time there, all this happened.
All this happened.
Oh my gosh.
All this happened.
Wow.
And,
How long was he there for? Do you remember?
He was there from early the first week in July through first week in December.
So about 6 months.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So he really got to know people.
Yeah.
And he was
I just want to make sure that I understand too, that is this the point where he was also doing his touring and speaking to the public back in the lower 48, or was that to come later?
He had been doing some speaking before he went up to Alaska. He had begun speaking. His friends had urged him into a speaking career. First of all, he wasn't making much money and needed to pay some rent. And they kept saying, you're such a good talker, right? And so, but he was an interpersonal talker. He wasn't a public speaker. I'm a public speaking teacher, so this is part of what's fascinating to me about it, that finally they convinced him, look, you can make some good money. And Muir even wrote in his journal, it wasn't that I wanted to give the speech, but the Scot in me couldn't turn down the money. And so he went to Sacramento. His first speech was in Sacramento in 1876, so 3 years before he went to Alaska. And he gave a speech there to a big audience to the church in Sacramento, and people loved him. And the newspaper reporters, the reviews of it were great. And so more and more people started picking up on that. And he wasn't super busy, not like he would be after he came back from Alaska. But the way he got to Alaska was he got an invitation from the General Presbyteriate to be a speaker at Yosemite about glaciers. And so there was a big, in June or May of 1879, there was a big conference there. About 300 Presbyterians had come there from all over the country. They'd taken train rides. Now they're in Yosemite, which was pretty rough and tumble at that point. But he gives a speech about glaciers carving the mountains and that sort of thing, and they love it. And Sheldon Jackson, who was also there, who was the secretary of the General Presbyteriate of the West, everything west of the Mississippi, Sheldon Jackson was in charge of. So he started more than 200 churches in the West, Presbyterian churches. Anyway, he was one of the speakers. And after Muir had spoken for the second time, Jackson went up to him and said, since you're talking about Alaska and glaciers, perhaps you would like to join me and my brethren in 10 days when we go up to our first mission in Alaska. And then you can see the glaciers firsthand. And Muir jumped at the chance. He got his stuff together. He took off with the Presbyterian elders from San Francisco in 10 days. And he wrote his fiancée, Louie, he wrote his first letter telling her what was up from Wrangell, saying, oh, by the way, dear, I'm in Alaska now, and I don't know when I'm going to be back. He was supposed to be at her parents' house that summer in the farm, taking care of the farm, but oops, Wanderlust took him up to the glaciers.
And how old was he at this point?
41.
41, yeah. It's such a great, and we could just keep talking about this, right? But I'm just going to suggest that read the book, read your book to really kind of get the experience of what it was like when he was there. I mean, you've just shared a small sliver of some of the stories that I got in the book, and then of course, my travels in Alaska is really about that trip in 1879, written years later. And in the book, we include drawings, sketches. Wrangell Island is one of the drawings that's in there. And then we have the foreword and the introduction, which touch on this aspect of the racism, which you just went through and explained it so much better than what I've heard. Because I think a lot of us, when we hear the word racism, we think it's very limited, or it's very specific to a class or to a type of person or to a race.
Right.
But this is not necessarily that from what you've said. It's really more of a kind of, and it's something that changes too, because we've had experiences of people that don't change and they get worse the older they get. And this is somebody who was, like you said, a product of his times. And as he grows and has more experience, in this 6 months in Alaska profoundly changed him because of his interaction with the people there, right? And it's not like he comes back and he's like saying the same stuff anymore. He's saying something different. He's actually found his kindred people.
Right. And he would get into debates, in fact, with people down there. People were saying, oh, how'd you do among those savages? He would say, they're not savages. They're more civilized than you, sir. And they would get into, because Muir, would debate at the drop of a hat and put all of his fire and fury into it. And he got into a debate one time with a Civil War general, and they were talking about Native Americans. And then finally the Observer said they walked off arm in arm talking about how good Native Americans were, after he had talked. So it's the same thing goes on today. If you live in Gillette, Wyoming all of your life and you never meet a black person, and then you meet somebody, now you have a relationship with that person. Now you understand them as a human being. You're not going to objectify them once you meet them. And I think that is a big subtext to what's going on out there. Is it's not a cognitive concept, it is a heart concept. You have to feel mano a mano. You have to meet somebody and talk to them, and it's like, oh, that person's smart, none of the other things that other people told me that I might assume about those people, those seem evident, that sort of thing. So it's all about relationships more than about thinking about it as a race. So you mentioned class. I mean, I think it was probably a little bit more about class. And for Muir, the classiest people were the people who live closest to nature. But it's important to note also that the Tlingits are fierce capitalists. Material objects are very, very important to them and obtain sacred status ultimately. Even like an American flag that was given to them by William Seward, that still exists, and it's used as a tablecloth at potlucks and memorial services. And it is a sacred object. And Tlingits are CEOs, they have corporations, they're political, they live in big houses, they drive nice cars. They're very much in the human family. And I think you recognize that.
Yeah, that's just great. And I just want to make sure we just give a little segue to the fact that you're going to be presenting and at the symposium where we premiered the John Muir movie in 2018. And we met John Muir descendants, and it was a real honor to be there and have that experience. I know that I was in touch with Robert Hanna before that event, but he was unable to come. I think one of his daughters had a softball tournament. But I did note when I looked up, I was talking to Mike Wirtz to kind of see what the agenda was for the event that's happening on April 23rd, that Carolyn Finney is speaking, which is going to be really fascinating, because if you don't know who she is, and I did not know who she was, so I had to do a little research, but Robert had her on his show, and he has an hour-long talk with her, and I think it's right around the time the Sierra Club was like outing John Muir. There was a lot of talk, and Robert was being asked to speak about, was being kind of called up by the press to talk about his relationship to John Muir, who was his great-great-grandfather. But he gets Carolyn Finney on the phone on this call, and they have this really heart-to-heart talk about what racism is, how it affects, how do we need to acknowledge it. So you're most likely going to have a really interesting experience in a couple of weeks. And I wish I could be there. I know it's not Zoomed. You have to be in person. Yeah. Right. Tickets are available. I'll provide a link on this video so people can go and get more of this. But I'd like to talk to you after that.
Oh yeah, no, I'm a debate coach, and so just bring it on. I have a feeling it's not going to be too contentious, but I am eager. I'll talk to anybody about this, and I'm not intimidated by people who have strong feelings the other way, because I have evidence. I've talked to the descendants of people who met Muir, Native Americans, and many of them I quote in my book. And when I asked the president of the village, why do you people like John Muir? She said he was the first white guy that we met who didn't want something from us. Because prior to that, they all wanted to know where the gold was or where the furs were or something like that. But Muir he said, quote unquote, you have, in one of his speeches to the Chilkat, you have a fine, foodful land. And when you honor the foodful land of the Tlingits, you are honoring their subsistence traditions. And they're like, damn straight, we have a foodful land. That's part of our wealth. And so he did the right thing rhetorically all the way down the line with that.
That's great. So, I really appreciate you sharing that with us and with me, because it's, I always learn more and more about John Muir, and my film was never intended to be like the thing of everything about him, like a National Geographic or PBS, but more about that experience that we have with nature, and then the difference of experience with nature and then experience with the people that live in nature, and how that informs us about the nature that we're experiencing. And that falls into like land acknowledgement acknowledging the land for the people that were there before us and who are still there. And, you know, that gives us a much richer experience. And so I see in John Muir's travels in Alaska, you know, that same sort of experience that I encountered, and then I'm sure other people encounter today still as we travel in the lands that surround us where we currently live, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm so thrilled, by the way, that your book is coming out, or the 1879 trip and 1881, et cetera, because it needs to be refreshed. There's a new audience waiting out there. They are waiting for maybe different reasons, and audiences have looked at it in the past. My book started selling a little bit more when the racism issue came up, because people started looking into what's going on here, you know. And I don't think I mentioned the word colonization once in my book, but it is about that. It's not meant to be a political book. It's meant to be a rhetorical study. So, you know, persuasive messages between these. But it's a rollicking story, and, you know, Travels in Alaska is a beautiful, rollicking story. There's a lot of adventure in that. And, you know, people who are picking up your book and looking at it might want to realize that pages from that book were on Muir's chest when they found him in his bed dead on that Christmas morning, 1914, I believe. And the pages that were on his chest were from chapter 8, in the land of the Chilkats. And so it's the one chapter in all of the writing that Muir did. It's the one chapter that is solely dedicated to Native American experience. I mean, all through the book, there's a lot of Native American experiences, but in that book, in the land of the Chilkats, it's all about his experience with Native Americans. And so you can pick up a lot from that. And then if you're really interested, of course, you can go back to the digital archives available through University of the Pacific, which I looked at and which are awesome. It is so great to read Muir's journals, which have a lot that is not in the book. Read the book first, then you'll be set up, and then you can look at the journals, and of course they're online. So it's a beautiful thing.
Yeah, well, thank you. Thank you again.